We need to begin by saying that we do not oppose nor do we support the visit of President Barack Obama to Cuba. We will emit an opinion after the President goes to Cuba and does whatever he plans to do in the island. We believe that if the President goes to Cuba and he links himself with the government and maybe meets with selected opposition members, but does not substantially meet with the civil society and does not speak about human rights and democracy, the President will be indeed legitimizing further the Cuban dictatorship, something that he has already helped to give and project a better image of that regime in the United States, according to some studies that have been made of the public opinion in regards to that. If the President, on the other hand, speaks about human rights, if he speaks about democracy for Cuba, if he meets with the civil society in the island, then the President's visit will be a fruitful one that will yield good results in terms of public opinion and even in terms of hope for the Cuban people. We must begin by saying that the freedom of Cuba comes from the Cuban people. It does not come from a foreign law. It does not come from a foreign leader. It comes from the heart of the Cuban nation. But solidarity from other people, other countries, is essential in these times of interrelations where, as we know, the world has become a lot smaller. So, going to Cuba, speaking about freedom, democracy, human rights, will really help, will really lend a hand to the Cuban people. And I think there are very concrete things that the President can talk about, can advocate for. The first thing is, what is going to happen when Raúl Castro steps down from the 57-year-long mandate in Cuba on the 24th of February of 2018? Is he going to elect with his finger the successor? Or are they going to be elections? We do not hear anybody talking about how that's going to happen. Indeed, what we're at least hearing is how Mr. Díaz-Canel, Cuba's vice president, looks more like Richard Gere. Like if the Cuban people needed their president to look like some other person to be accepted. The Cuban people has not elected Mr. Díaz-Canel. They have not elected anybody since much before the Cuban Revolution, when Fulgencio Batista gave the coup d'etat, participated in the coup d'etat and took over the country's destinies. So it's been more than 60-some years that most Cubans have not been able to use the ballots to elect their leaders. This is the time where we are asking the world to join with the voice of the Cuban people to demand free elections for the Cuban people, so that come the 24th of February 2018, the Cuban people will have free, internationally supervised elections or a referendum, so that we can elect the system that we freely want, not the one that the Castro family wants for our country and have indeed imposed for 60 years, or nearly 60 years. The President can advocate for free elections. The President can advocate for family reunification. Cuba is a country divided by the policies of the Cuban government. each and every Cuban family have been divided by those policies, causing that more than 20% of Cuba's population are now living in exile, versus less than a fraction of 1% before this regime took over. It's time for the Cuban family to be able to reunite. But the Cuban government does not allow that to happen because it has established a very lucrative industry with the division of the Cuban people. It gets anywhere between $4 billion to $6 billion every year out of the pain that it causes in the Cuban people with the division. And the government is not about to give up that lucrative business unless there is sufficient international pressure for him to do that. So the President of the United States can help, can advocate for that to be addressed. The President can advocate for the release of the political prisoners, but that would not be sufficient. We do not want to see the President going over there asking for the release of 50 more political prisoners, which Castro will incarcerate a little bit later and continue to use as tools of negotiations. We don't want that. We want Castro's commitment to not continue to incarcerate people for political reasons. So that's another issue. The issue of the Cuban rafters. As I speak to you now, we're trying to know the destiny of a boat with 30 people that departed Isla de la Juventud in Cuba. And nobody knows where they are. And some rumors indicate to us that they were shot by Cuban gunboats. According to some information that we have from some relatives that unfortunately up to now are very scared to talk, because this looks like one of those smuggling operations. But according to the families in Cuba, somebody in the boat called Cuba, still within Cuban waters, and said, we have everybody on board, the 30 people, but we're being chased by Cuban gunboats and they are shooting at us. And then nobody heard from the boat anymore. And that's since the 5th of February. And there are many others lost in these high seas. This is not because of the Cuban Adjustment Act. It is because of the dictatorship that exists in Cuba. And this is very important because as long as we continue to look at the symptoms instead of going to the root, there will not be a solid solution to this. And this needs to be addressed not only from the government standpoint, trying to do away with the Cuban Adjustment Act here, but the Cuban government as well and the Cuban society. We need to revert the lack of hope in the Cuban people, and that only happens if the people see that something is changing in the island. So that's another issue. Another issue, our right to return to our homeland. I claim my right to return. Barack Obama yesterday extended the proclamation against the democracy movement. I don't care if they say it's for everybody. Yeah, it is for everybody, but in 20 years has only been enforced against the democracy movement. That emergency proclamation is directed at preventing our demonstrations from reaching Cuban waters. And the United States puts its Coast Guard in the difficult and embarrassing situation of stopping peaceful people who demonstrate and enter their own water to mourn and pray for children that have been murdered by that dictatorship. That needs to be addressed, and the President can address it as well. And finally, the President can advocate for what we call a national encounter in Cuban soil of all Cubans. I would like to go. We need to speak. In the same way that the Cuban regime opened itself to its longtime enemy, the United States, one questions why doesn't he do that with his own people that he's supposed to represent? We want to go there to advocate, to work, to help, to contribute losing the fears so that we can rebuild a civil society in our homeland. We can help. We will not work towards maintaining a dictatorship in Cuba just for some rich capitalist outside to have the opportunity to go there and do business, pay the government, and then the government gives a tiny amount to the workers. That's not our vision of reforms. That's our vision of exploitation by the state with the contribution and support of a foreign power. We don't want that. That has to change. So those are the things we are advocating for, and this is why on the 21st of March, when the president goes to Cuba, the democracy movement wants to be there advocating to give the Cuban people the voice that they don't have now. We are taking a flotilla. It will be a small flotilla. We are a small, unimportant group, so therefore we do tiny things to near Cuba with the lights of freedom, to send our message of hope to the Cuban people. At the same time, they are visiting here, they're going back. They will be working together, and they're already working in Cuba, to have the Cuban people inside the island go to El Malecón, to Cuba's Havana seawall, to be there when the flotilla is there. We are also calling for the people of Cuba inside their home, when they're watching Barack Obama on their own TV, to get their casseroles and protest, not the president. We're not protesting. This is not a protest against the president. It's not. This is a protest. This is a demand to give voice to the Cuban people so that they can elect their own president. So, to protest with casseroles, like it has been done in Venezuela and other places, and at times in Cuba, demanding democracy for Cuba, demanding freedom of economic freedoms for the Cuban people. We're also calling for the people to go where the president will be speaking to the crowd. He will be allowed, apparently, to speak to the crowd openly. So to go there, and when you're there, meditate in freedom. Think of freedom. Murmur freedom. And if they believe it prudent, demand freedom. Cry out freedom for the Cuban people. It's a very simple thing, very complex in Cuba. This is what we plan to do, and they will be working with this inside of Cuba. We have spoken with our attorneys. We have a meeting next week. I have talked to separate attorneys, but we have a meeting of the team next week to address the presidential proclamation. They are already concerned. The Cuban regime has already attacked us through a character called named Percy Francisco Alvarado, who speaks on behalf of the government on the social on the web. And he has already attacked us, and he indeed has threatened us already. So this is what at this point we're doing.